A root metaphor in philosophy is a fundamental, often implicit conceptual framework that shapes how individuals or cultures understand the world and interpret experience. It functions as a foundational assumption about the nature of reality, serving as a lens through which all other knowledge and understanding are structured. The concept was introduced by American philosopher Stephen C. Pepper in his 1942 Work World Hypotheses, where he argued that root metaphors are essential in epistemology, as there is no such thing as pure objective fact free from interpretation. According to Pepper, a root metaphor is the point of origin for a world hypothesis, derived from a common sense observation that is then used to interpret other phenomena. Pepper identified four major world hypotheses, each grounded in a distinct root metaphor: formism, based on similarity in classification; mechanism, viewing the world as a machine composed of parts; contextualism, understanding events as acts in context; and organicism, seeing the world as a living, self-regulating organism. These root metaphors are not merely literary devices, but deeply influence how people perceive reality, make decisions, and construct meaning. For instance, the metaphor of life as a journey or argument as war can shape behavior and thought in profound ways, often unconsciously. Root metaphors are not limited to individual thought. They can also define entire cultural, religious, or societal worldviews. For example, Loyal Rue describes the root metaphor of Abrahamic religions as God as person, which integrates cosmology and morality into a single unifying idea. Similarly, the metaphor of entropy has been used as a root metaphor in economic and historical interpretations, reflecting a worldview where order inevitably decays into chaos. These metaphors are powerful because they organize vast arrays of assumptions, values, and beliefs into a coherent system, influencing everything from personal identity to political ideology. In essence, a root metaphor is a comprehensive, organizing analogy that helps individuals and groups make sense of their experiences, define the meaning of life, and guide action. As philosopher Earl McCormack stated, it is the most basic assumption about the nature of the world or experience that we can make when we try to give a description of it. Because they are often so deeply embedded in language and culture, root metaphors can be difficult to recognize, yet they profoundly constrain or enable thought and action.
Metaphor in Philosophy by Stephen Pepper. Reprinted from the Journal of Mind and Behavior, Volume 3, NOS 3 and 4, Summer/Autumn, 1982, a special issue of that journal devoted to Pepper and edited by Art Efron. The JMB reprinted the essay, in turn, from Stephen C. Pepper, Metaphor in Philosophy, Dictionary of History of Ideas, Volume 3. Philip P. Weiner, Editor-in-Chief, Copyright, 1973, Charles Scribner Sons. Introduction. One special use of metaphor in philosophy. Metaphor in philosophy may be distinguished from metaphor in poetry by being primarily an explanatory rather than an aesthetic device. Its explanatory function is to aid in conceptual clarification, comprehension, or insight regarding a mode of philosophical thought, a problem or an area of philosophical subject matter, or even a total philosophical system. However, the boundary between the aesthetic and the explanatory use of metaphor is admittedly vague. A philosopher may even deliberately select a metaphor for its aesthetic vividness and impact, as with Bergson's Elah Vital or William James's Stream of Consciousness, and notoriously the Mystics, but the question of the metaphors having philosophical relevance depends on its explanatory function. Does it contribute to an understanding of the philosophy? There are relatively superficial uses of metaphor in philosophy, and there are permeating uses. The superficial uses occur when figures of speech are scattered along the written pages to vivify some other unusual conception, and drop out when the conception is grasped. But when the metaphor's use is permeating, it may never completely disappear even after it gets ritualized and deadened under an accepted technical vocabulary within a philosophical school. It has been frequently noticed that a new mode of thinking or a new school of philosophy as it is emerging and finding itself tends to be expressed in figurative language. This is inevitable before a technical vocabulary is developed with clear definitions and specific designations. Generally, This preliminary tendency is to be regarded as a superficial use of metaphor in philosophy. It is the more permeating use that deserves most attention. In this connection, the term metaphor should not be taken in too literal accordance with a definition often found in elementary books on prosody. It is not just a simile with the preposition like left out. It is rather the use of one part of experience to illuminate another, to help us understand, comprehend, even to intuit, or enter into the other. The metaphorical element may ultimately be absorbed completely into what it is a metaphor of. The one element, as frequently explained, is reduced to the other. The paradox of a metaphor is that it seems to affirm an identity while also half denying it. All things are water, Thales seems to say. In so saying, he would be affirming an identity and yet acknowledging that it is not obvious, and that what is more obvious is the difference. He claims an insight beyond the conventional view of things. It becomes incumbent on him to show how the identity can be justified. The same is true of Lucretius identifying all things with atoms and a void, and of many other philosophers' modes of identification of the whole of reality with some general aspect of it. 2. The root metaphor theory. The thought was bound to arise sooner or later that metaphor in the above sense was the characteristic mode of developing philosophic theories. Perhaps the first emphatic expression of this thought is in Francis Bacon's discussion of the idols, in particular the idol of the theatre, which he described as man's tendency to develop comprehensive systems in the language of myth and fantasy far beyond the data of observation. He was pleading for a method of solid empirical cognition in terms of collecting diverse instances of a subject to lift out the form that held them together. His intention was to disparage the use of metaphors, and he virtually excluded their use in hypotheses as means of cognition, although he did recognize them as anticipations of nature. However, in recent times, with a more generous conception of the use of hypotheses as constructive instruments for both scientific and philosophical thinking, the metaphorical conception of the origin and development of philosophical thinking has been revived without any pejorative connotations. In World Hypotheses, 1942, this view is called the root metaphor theory. It is itself an hypothesis about the origin and development of schools of philosophy, or, more specifically, of world hypotheses. World hypotheses are distinguished from the more limited hypotheses of the special sciences by being unrestricted in their subject matter or in the scope of the evidence the hypotheses are expected to cover. An hypothesis in optics can reject as irrelevant any items that do not bear on optical phenomena or laws, as would be the case for so many observations in acoustics, geology, astronomy, linguistics, or social psychology. But a world hypothesis cannot be exclusive in this manner, for it cannot evade a group of items that do not seem to fit nicely into its system by declaring them outside its field and so irrelevant. Everything is relevant to a world hypothesis. The root metaphor theory gains a good deal of credibility if one is persuaded that methods of deriving philosophical systems from claims of certainty, such as those of infallibility, self-evidence, or indubitable and incorrigible data, have proved unreliable. Once such methods of philosophizing from supposedly certain bases of knowledge have been given up, methods for seeking probable knowledge by way of hypotheses and their confirmation become acceptable. And this is the point of departure for the root metaphor theory of philosophic thought. The problem then arises as to what are the sources of world hypotheses. The suggestion is that world hypotheses get started like any man's everyday hypothesis framed to solve some puzzling practical problem. The man looks back over his past experience for some analogous situation which might be applicable to his present problem. Similarly, a philosopher, puzzled about the nature of the universe, looks about for some pregnant experience that appears to be a good sample of the nature of things. This is his root metaphor. He analyzes his sample, selects its structural elements, and generalizes them as guiding concepts for a world hypothesis of unlimited scope. This set of concepts becomes the set of categories of his world hypothesis. If the world hypothesis proves fruitful in its application to the varied items of the world, it will be adopted by other men, and a school of philosophy comes into being, dedicated to the development of this world theory, Weltanschauung. Its categories will be refined and modified to render them as adaptable as possible to the total range of the world's facts to which they are applied. The root metaphor itself becomes refined by this process. There evolves a give and take between the categories and the facts to which they are applied. The categories are modified to fit the facts, and the facts are interpreted in terms of the categories. The philosophers of the school will then perceive the facts as they are structured by their categories, and the ultimate facts in terms of their categories will come to appear to these philosophers as indubitable. Then it can become almost impossible to disabuse them of the certainty of the foundations of their philosophy except by introducing them to an alternative but equally justifiable world theory constructed with another set of categories yielding a different interpretation of the facts and a different group of apparent indubitables. Only a limited number of categorical sets, however, according to this root metaphor theory, have proved fruitful enough to acquire a relatively adequate interpretation of the full scope of the world's facts. The position held in World Hypotheses was, up to the time of its publication, that the fruitful root metaphors could be reduced to four: 1. Formism, based on the root metaphor of similarity, or the identity of a single form in a multiplicity of particular exemplifications; 2. Mechanism, based on the root metaphor of material push and pull, or attraction and repulsion culminating in the conception of a machine or an electromagnetic gravitational field; 3. Organicism, based on the root metaphor of a dynamic organic whole, as elaborated by Hegel and his followers; and 4. Contextualism, based on the root metaphor of a transitory historical situation and its biological tensions as exhibited by Dewey and his followers. None of these is fully adequate. There are also several less adequate root metaphors, and in World Hypotheses it is suggested that still more adequate ones may appear in the future. 3. The extensiveness of metaphor in philosophy. One corollary of the root metaphor theory is that any treatment of the topic of metaphor in philosophy would spread over the whole history of the subject. Not only are the great traditional systems caught up in the action of metaphorical interpretations, but the cultural concepts and institutions dominating the beliefs and values of ordinary men are impregnated with them. Common sense and ordinary language have long been saturated with the presuppositions of Platonic, Aristotelian, and Cartesian metaphysics, and lately in many cultures with the Hegelian dialectic and contextualistic operationalism. If to these relatively adequate philosophies are added the metaphorical presuppositions of a number of humanly fascinating inadequate philosophies such as animism and mysticism, the spread of the influence of philosophic metaphors in the cultural thought and practices of men is enormously extended. The mention of animism leads one inevitably to think of mythology. Here metaphor runs rampant and with cosmic references also. Its intent is apparently to be as philosophically explanatory as Aristotle's categories of form and matter or A.S. Eddington's space-time gravitation. This close relation of primitive myth to the relatively adequate philosophies named above in respect to the explanatory use of metaphor should not prejudice one against the relatively adequate world hypotheses or their presuppositions incorporated in modern common sense and in modern science and logic. As long as men must make hypotheses to solve their problems, they will seek analogies to stimulate their invention, and when these analogies generate explanatory categories, these immediately function as explanatory metaphors. The important thing is to find explanatory hypotheses that are widely confirmable, and here is where the difference ties between primitive myth and adequate hypothesis. 4 categories and metaphors in philosophy. The close connection brought out above between a set of categories for a world hypothesis and their generating root metaphor raises the question as to how the metaphorical basis of a set of categories could ever come to light. For the categories are inevitably conceived by the indoctrinated exponents of the philosophy as the actual structural framework of nature. The metaphor is amalgamated with what it is a metaphor of. To a philosopher fully immersed in his system, other interpretations of the world than his are treated simply as errors or meaningless or, perhaps charitably, as partial approximations to the truth. To become aware of the metaphorical nature of one's philosophical interpretations, there is need of a certain amount of cognitive distance, like the aesthetic distance required in the arts to appreciate the realism of a play or a novel or a picture. Yet the distance must not be so great as to convert the object into pure fantasy and absurdity. In art one must recognize the conventions which support and sustain the aesthetic realism. So in philosophy one must recognize the categories that maintain the truth or interpretive adequacy of the world theory. The categories must be taken seriously as constructive instruments serving, like glasses to astigmatic eyes, to reveal reality truly or effectively in ways we have not previously seen. Bacon completely missed the significance of comprehensive philosophy through his lack of recognition of this cognitive distance. He noticed correctly the metaphorical interpretive action of the traditional philosophies, but failed to appreciate the revelatory power of the great systems and the fruitfulness of their metaphors. At what point in the history of philosophy did an appreciation of the metaphorical action of categories emerge? The ground was laid by Kant when, in his Critique of Pure Reason, he argued that the structures of space, time, causality, etc., attributed to nature in scientific cognition were provided by the mind and should not be taken as the intrinsic structures of things in themselves. He introduced a little distance between phenomena and the interpretive action of his categories, and also space and time, which he distinguished as a priori forms of intuition. But he regarded his categories as a priori and inescapable and incorrigible in cognition. As C.I. Lewis later pointed out in his Mind and the World Order, 1929, there was more than a paradox implicit in Kant's view. There was a self-contradiction, that of being at the same time real and not real operations among cosmic events. For how could a thinker distinguish his interpretive categories from the structure of nature itself unless he had at least one other set of categories with divergent interpretations with which to compare them? In short, the categories must be regarded as corrigible. They must be open to error and correction. They cannot be posited as wholly a priori and inescapable in human cognition. They must be allowed enough distance between themselves and what they are interpreting to permit of alternatives and judgments of their adequacy. They must be treated in some degree as explanatory hypotheses, or metaphors. That Kant had some awareness of this dilemma is obvious from his treatment of moral and aesthetic experiences as distinct from that of scientific experience. In moral experience particularly, he found he could bypass the categorical restrictions of scientific cognition and obtain some authoritative disclosures about the non-perceptual world. He accepted in a questionable way the ideas of God, freedom, and immortality for the moral life and its justification. Here, in a way, were the two sets of categories which revealed to him that the deterministic scientific categories clearly could not be attributed to such structural features of things in themselves as God, freedom, and immortality. It should be acknowledged that there were many earlier premonitions of some sort of mental projections upon external things. Descartes' mind-matter dualism had already raised the issue, Spinoza's theory of attributes, Locke's stress on the distinction between primary and secondary qualities, a distinction that can be traced as far back as Democritus, and finally Hume's analysis of impressions, causality, and habit, and his reluctant admission that he just could not help believing in an external world, although he could not understand how he could justify any belief in it. Following Kant, Hegel's dialectic can be viewed as a proliferation of Kantian categories ordered according to their increasing degree of scope and adequacy till they culminated in the total synthesis of the absolute. But still the categories were not entirely shaken loose from the actual structure of things they categorized. The dialectic was not only a history of increasingly adequate cognition but also a history of a kind of cosmic growth. It was not till pragmatic or contextualistic modes of thought began to be influential that enough distance was introduced between the instruments of cognition and what they cognized for sets of categories to be viewed as metaphors. It was the typical pragmatic theory of concepts as instruments that made this possible. The pragmatic analysis of categories by C.I. Lewis has been mentioned. And Hans Weingers' Philosophy of as if, Die Philosophie de l'Alsob, 1911, may have helped too, though his doctrine of fictions was cognitively ambiguous in leaving one in doubt as to their cognitive function. If the useful concepts are rendered too fictional, the sense of metaphor may be almost totally lost. In order to maintain the metaphorical character of a set of guiding concepts, the structure of the concepts must in some degree be identified with what the concepts are applied to. A committed contextualist may accordingly be as unaware of the metaphorical relations of the categorical presuppositions of his own philosophical view as any of the traditional philosophers of the earlier schools. The service of contextualism in revealing the explanatory use of metaphor in philosophy is due solely to its theory of the instrumental role of concepts in knowledge. Emphasis on this role revealed just the degree of cognitive distance that has to be recognized before the metaphorical character of a set of categories can be consciously realized. Once this is realized, a set of categories acquires the role of a useful hypothesis, and a philosopher becomes wary of regarding the categories as a priori or incorrigible features of the world or of the mind's way of looking at the world. Yet one is aware that the categories direct one's view of the world, and one can become critical of the adequacy of the view, and can deliberately seek out other sets of categories offering other views. Then it is possible for one to see that these views are functioning as cognitive metaphors. And if one seeks out the core and origin of these world metaphors, he reaches what may be called their root metaphors. 5 cognitive metaphors of restricted scope. The term root metaphor seems to have entered the language of philosophy in other ways than that of the source of the categories of world hypotheses. It has come often to refer to any central idea about which any complex problem can be organized. It becomes then the point of reference for a restricted or special hypothesis. When so used, it overlaps the function lately assigned by extending it over what has come to be known as the paradigm case. The term paradigm case acquired importance in philosophy mainly through an analysis by Ludwig Wittgenstein of the meaning in ordinary language of such terms as chair, leaf, game. He found that such terms are used to refer to a group of objects which as a group are not characterized by a set of common characteristics. But as a group they have family resemblances. During childhood men learn the range of application of these family resemblance concepts, which become perfectly well understood by all who speak that ordinary language. Such a concept can be identified or pivoted on any one of its typical objects, from which the family resemblances can be traced out to the other members of the group. Such a conveniently selected member would be the paradigm case for the group. The paradigm case furnishes the analogy from which the family resemblances of the other members can be traced. It could be called the root metaphor of a fancily resemblance concept. Some writers appear to be using the term root metaphor in much this way. It is one important way of using metaphor in philosophy. It is clearly an explanatory, not aesthetic, use of metaphor, and falls well within the topic of this article. It can even be argued that the root metaphors of world hypotheses should better be described as paradigm cases of groups of world hypotheses making up the various schools of philosophy. Thus the world hypotheses of Plato, Aristotle, Aquinas, and many others are easily recognized as having family resemblances pivoting on the relation of form and matter. When one type of formism is presented as representative of the group, this might be offered as a paradigm case for the group. This chief difference between this interpretation and the root metaphor theory is that in this view a philosophical school exhibits a development of a root metaphor towards a more nearly adequate structure for a comprehensive view of the world. The Wittgensteinian family resemblance concept does not suggest any such developmental process, or allow that the paradigm case which might be selected possesses any special explanatory superiority in respect to the precision and scope of the application of the concept to what may be called its field of application. Indeed, the case is quite the reverse. All members of a family resemblance group are on a par, and there is no presumption of the group yielding any special explanatory insight beyond the fact of the family resemblances which the concept records in the usage of ordinary language. However, some recent writers have spread the use of paradigm so as to include the progressive degrees of adequacy exhibited by the paradigm to its field of application. Thomas S. Kuhn in particular has developed this conception in his The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, 1962. According to his exposition, there is practically no difference between the function of the paradigm as a guiding conceptual pattern in scientific procedure and that of the root metaphor as a guiding conceptual pattern in world hypotheses, except the restricted scope of the former. A paradigm for Kuhn is a model or pattern accepted in science like a judicial decision in the common law, an object for further articulation and specification under new or more stringent conditions. At the time of its first appearance, it is very limited in both scope and precision. The survival and endurance of a paradigm depends upon its success in solving problems which the practitioners in the field regard as acute. The success of a paradigm is at the start largely a promise of success discoverable in selected and still incomplete examples. Normal science consists in the actualization of that promise, an actualization achieved by extending the knowledge of those facts that the paradigm displays as particularly revealing, by increasing the extent of the match between those facts and the paradigm's predictions, and by further articulation of the paradigm itself, pages 23 to 24. According to Kuhn's description, the history of science can be almost equated with the history of the metaphors of limited scope in their pursuit of adequacy through their predictions and articulations in revealing the facts of their special fields. To what extent Kuhn's philosophy of science pivoting on the paradigm will be found acceptable, remains to be seen. It has the virtue of putting emphasis on the practicing scientist's use of models, which no treatment of scientific method, in the philosophy of science, can safely ignore. For if on Kuhn's view a scientific model is not quite equated with a paradigm, it must be regarded as at least a material or conceptual embodiment of one. If some form of the root metaphor theory for unrestricted hypotheses is combined with a form of paradigm theory like Kuhn's for restricted hypotheses, it would suggest that the basis of all productive empirical theory is in principle metaphorical. This would be no disparagement of it. It comes down simply to being realistic about what theories are as products of human creativity. There is, of course, also the formal logical and mathematical aspect of theory, which is perhaps properly regarded as the ideal terminal formulation of any empirical theory, whether in science or philosophy. But however contrasted the formal approach may be to the metaphorical, there seems to be no necessary incompatibility between the two in their joint pursuit of some control and understanding of our world. If there is an issue, it lies beyond the scope of this article. Bibliography, by Art Efron. The root metaphor theory of the basis of metaphysical thinking was developed by S. C. Pepper in his World Hypotheses, Berkeley, 1942, and later exemplified by a deliberately chosen new root metaphor in his Concept and Quality, La Salle, Ill, 1967. A somewhat similar theory was developed independently by Dorothy Emmett in The Nature of Metaphysical Thinking, London, 1945, extending the analogical principle also to myth, religion, and theology. The Compass of Philosophy, New York, 1945, by Newton R. Stalknecht and Robert S. Brumbach, carries on much the same idea by their stress on key concepts in metaphysics. And Charles Morris' Paths of Life, New York, 1942, is also relevant for a sort of statistical confirmation of the influence of key concepts in the attitudes of ordinary men. C. I. Lewis' Mind and the World Order, New York, 1929, has already been mentioned for stimulating the metaphorical conception of metaphysics. Hans Weyinger in his Die Philosophie de l'Alsob, Berlin, 191-1, trans. C. K. Ogden as Philosophy of As If, New York, 1924, was influential by distinguishing between scientific hypotheses, which could be true, and fictions, as ifs, which could not be true but had useful semi-cognitive functions. And metaphysical systems fell in the latter category. Philip Wheelwright in his The Burning Fountain, Bloomington, IND, 1962, speaks of the language of metaphor and the language of science as two equally legitimate ways of gaining cognitive insight into two different aspects of the world. Max Black, on the other hand, in his Models and Metaphors, Ithaca, N.Y. 1954, makes no such cognitive division but regards metaphors and models as valuable explanatory devices whether in the special sciences or in comprehensive metaphysics. This leads to Thomas Kuhn's still stronger view in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, Chicago, 1962, which, as pointed out already, regards models and paradigms, virtually in the role of root metaphors, as central explanatory instruments in science. For an exceptionally intensive and original treatment of metaphor in metaphysics and science, and poetry too, the two articles by D. Berggren, The Use and Abuse of Metaphor in the Review of Metaphysics, 16, 1962/1963, are recommended.
Six world hypotheses, or how we explain everything and anything. I recently came across this blog post by Christopher Peterson and was immediately drawn into the work of Stephen Pepper, and using Google Books Access tried to read as much as I could of his print-on-demand book, World Hypotheses. It is a philosophical work of how people reason about their world and carve nature at the joints, but despite being a philosophical work and thus being dense and obtuse to a degree, it is surprisingly lucidly written and, in my opinion, is an important work that needs to be highlighted. As per Pepper, we have four valid and mature world hypotheses that are adequate in scope, explain everything, and precision, explain uniquely and not vaguely, and two immature world hypotheses that fail the test of scope, precision, in their adequacy. I do not make that distinction and will be treating all six world hypotheses on equal footing. For the record, the inadequate world hypotheses are animism and spiritualism. A world hypothesis is a way to explain everything in the world and relies on root metaphors to explain thus. Each hypothesis has a pet root metaphor which is sued to illustrate and explain phenomenon or categories and their relationships. To met the six world hypotheses follow a stage pattern, and it would be my contention that as one matures, one may discard one world hypothesis lower down the ladder in favor of the other, more developed and mature. With that, let us introduce the world hypothesis. Also taking the lead from Peterson, I'll be taking an example of my neighbor playing loud music at 2 a.m. to illustrate different ways of explaining the same event according to the different hypotheses and different root metaphors, and we'll be lifting from the Peterson article the examples he gave there. The first hypothesis is that of formism, realism, Platonic idealism, that is, everything is explainable because they belong to a particular category, form, and have characteristic qualities. The root metaphor is that of analogy or similarity. Formism explains in terms of placing whatever we are trying to explain into a category form. Why did my neighbor play his music loudly at 2 a.m.? Because he is in a hole. This theory belongs to the first stage where one is more concerned with describing things and concerned with traits. The second hypothesis is that of animism, that is, everything, even inanimate things like weather, has an underlying spirit that explains the way it behaves. The root metaphor is that of spirit and agency. Animism explains by associating everything we are trying to explain with an underlying spirit that has agency. Why did my neighbor play his music loudly at 2 a.m.? Because he was suddenly possessed by the Michael Jackson spirit. This theory belongs to the second stage, trying to explain the phenomenon and concerned with impulses and agency. The third hypothesis is that of mechanism, most common amongst reductionist scientists. That is, everything is a machine following laws of cause and effect. If something happens, it happens because of a well-defined and unavoidable cause. The root metaphor is that of machine. Mechanism explains in terms of causes, events that regularly precede whatever we are trying to explain. Why did my neighbor play his music loudly at 2 a.m.? Because he passed all of his final exams, and that is what people do when they pass exams. This theory belongs to the third stage that tries to predict and is centered around observable behavior and causal chains. The fourth hypothesis is that of contextualism, pragmatism, that is, everything can be explained in terms of the context or surround in which the figure event takes place. This is most popular with historians who are used to see events as uniquely determined by the historical and cultural milieu. The root metaphor is that of a historic event. Contextualism explains in terms of the interplay between whatever we are trying to explain and its larger context. Why did my neighbor play his music loudly at 2 a.m.? Because it was Saturday night, and this is a college town. This theory is properly of the fourth stage, focused on how society, larger context, can influence and control the phenomenon, and is most concerned with social influences. The fifth hypothesis is that of organicism, absolute idealism, i.e., everything is an organic complex whole. The theory is still determinate, but as compared to mechanism, is life-oriented. The root metaphor is that of coherence. Facts are sparse at present, and as they emerge and become more complex, one reaches in the limits the absolute truth. Organicism explains in terms of the unfolding of the inherent nature of whatever we are trying to explain. Why did my neighbor play his music loudly at 2 a.m.? Because he is a young man who just moved into his own apartment. The fifth theory is at the fifth stage concerned with integration, individuation, etc., and is concerned with emergent properties. The sixth hypothesis is that if spiritualism, i.e., everything is not what it seems and can only be really grasped through the spiritual experience, the root metaphor is that of the spiritual experience. All said and done, there is no substitute for experience. The metaphor is also that of love and can be only felt interpersonally. Only love is real. Why did my neighbor play his music loudly at 2 a.m.? Because he loves music and felt at oneness with the world and forgot about time as he got absorbed in the music. This is clearly a jump from previous stages and belongs to stage 6, dealing with transcendence and interpersonal concerns. Of course, there are bound to be higher, 7 and 8 stage theories equally, and perhaps better explain the world. And I will be glad if readers can point me to those world hypotheses, no matter how inadequate mystic they may appear at first appearance. I'm hooked to Pepper. What about you? Share this.
Epistemological metaphors and the nature of philosophy. To appear in Metaphilosophy. Paul Thagard and Craig Beam. Abstract. This paper examines some of the most important metaphors and analogies that epistemologists have used to discuss the structure and validity of knowledge. After reviewing foundational, coherentist, and other metaphors for knowledge, we discuss the metaphilosophical significance of the prevalence of such metaphors. We argue that they support a view of philosophy as akin to science rather than poetry or rhetoric. Keywords: epistemology, metaphor, analogy, metaphilosophy, foundations, coherence. 1. Introduction. Epistemology is the branch of philosophy concerned with the origins, structure, methods, and validity of knowledge. In order to theorize about the nature of knowledge, epistemologists have used numerous metaphors and analogies, from Plato's cave to Quine's web of belief. This paper reviews some of the most important of these metaphors and discusses what they show about the nature of philosophy. Metaphors are used in many realms of discourse, ranging from poetry to political rhetoric to scientific theorizing. We argue that epistemological metaphors are best viewed as theoretical rather than poetic or rhetorical, so that their historical use supports a view of philosophy as the construction of descriptive and normative theories. Epistemological theories can be classified as either foundational or coherentist. Foundational theories attempt to ground knowledge in a solid base such as sense experience, empiricism, or a priori reasoning, rationalism. In contrast, coherentists argue that there are no foundations for our beliefs, whose justification derives from how well they fit together with each other. Many of the most influential foundationalists and coherentists have expounded and defended their theories using suggestive metaphors and analogies. Section 2 and 3 discuss foundational and coherentist metaphors, respectively, and Section 4 examines additional epistemological metaphors, including ones that concern the nature of philosophy as a whole. Section 5 then discusses the metaphilosophical significance of the prevalence of metaphor and analogy in epistemology. We make no sharp distinction between metaphor and analogy. Mundane metaphors such as "my job is a jail" need not involve much of the systematic relational mapping that is the hallmark of analogy, but fertile metaphors such as "Socrates is a midwife" are always based on underlying analogies. Holyoake and Thagard, 1995, p. 217. Socrates is a midwife because his helping people to bring forth ideas is structurally similar to a midwife's helping mothers to deliver babies. Saying that knowledge has foundations is a metaphorical claim based on an analogy that we now explain. 2. Foundational metaphors. The Oxford English Dictionary, 2nd edition, defines a foundation as the solid ground or base, natural or built up, on which an edifice or other structure is erected. Many philosophers have sought a ground or base on which knowledge could be erected. To say that knowledge has or needs a foundation is to use a metaphor based on a systematic analogy between the development of knowledge and the construction of a building. Descartes, 1984, Volume 2, p. 366, explicitly endorses this analogy. Throughout my writings I have made it clear that my method imitates that of the architect. When an architect wants to build a house which is stable on ground where there is a sandy topsoil over underlying rock, or clay, or some other firm base, he begins by digging out a set of trenches from which he removes the sand, and anything resting on or mixed in with the sand, so that he can lay his foundations on firm soil. In the same way, I began by taking everything that was doubtful and throwing it out, like sand, and then, when I noticed that it is impossible to doubt that a doubting or thinking substance exists, I took this as the bedrock on which I could lay the foundations of my philosophy. Just as the architect who wants to build a stable house must find a firm base for it, so Descartes who wants to establish stable knowledge must doubt everything in order to find a firm base for his beliefs. This analogy involves many interconnected correspondences, including architect/epistemologist, house/knowledge, build/justify, base/indubitable knowledge, and sand/dubitable beliefs. See Newman 1999 for a discussion of Descartes foundationalism. Descartes, 1984, Volume 2, p. 324, also used another analogy in defending his method of doubt, responding to a critic as follows. Suppose he had a basket full of apples, and being worried that some of the apples were rotten, wanted to take out the rotten ones to prevent the rot spreading. Would he not begin by tipping the whole lot out of the basket? And would not the next step be to cast his eye over each apple in turn, and pick up and put back in the basket only those he saw to be sound, leaving the others? Like the foundation analogy, this one serves to justify Descartes' procedure of trying to start from indubitable beliefs, which correspond to good apples, while abandoning dubitable beliefs, which correspond to rotten apples. A third metaphor used by Descartes, 1984, Volume 1, p. 120, to expound his epistemology is that of a chain of reasoning. The long chains composed of very simple and easy reasonings, which geometers customarily use to arrive at their most difficult demonstrations, had given me occasion to suppose that all the things which can fall under human knowledge are interconnected in the same way. Below we describe Peirce's critique of the conception of knowledge as based on a chain of inference. Like Descartes, Spinoza thought the foundation of knowledge lay in a priori reasoning, which he exposited by analogy to Euclidean geometry. His book Ethics, demonstrated in geometrical order, proceeds by definitions and axioms that are used to justify a series of propositions, just as Euclid proved geometrical theorems. As did Descartes, Spinoza wanted philosophical knowledge to be as securely demonstrated as mathematics. Similarly, Leibniz thought that distinct knowledge could be gained by the light of nature that provides knowledge of innate ideas, which are like veins in marble that wait to be uncovered. Leibniz 1981, pages 84, 87. Empiricist philosophers have looked for the foundation of knowledge in sense experience rather than a priori demonstration, and have accordingly employed a different set of metaphors. Here is John Locke, 1961, Volume 1, p. 77. Let us then suppose the mind to be, as we say, white paper, void of all characters, without any ideas. How comes it to be furnished? Whence comes it by that vast store, which the busy and boundless fancy of man has painted on it, with an almost endless variety? Whence has it all the materials of reason and knowledge? To this I answer, in one word, from experience, in that, all our knowledge is founded, and from that it ultimately derives itself. Our observation, employed either about external, sensible objects, or about the internal operations of our minds, perceived and reflected on by ourselves, is that, which supplies our understanding with all the materials of thinking. These two are the fountains of knowledge, from whence all the ideas we have, or can naturally have, do spring. Here the main correspondences are paper/mind and writing/experience. Implicit in the comparison is the foundational presupposition that observation makes on the mind veridical impressions of objects. A similar analogy was used much earlier by Aristotle, who compared knowledge to writing on a blank tablet, Aristotle 1984, p. 683, 430a. He also said that sense experience is like the impression that a signet ring makes on a piece of wax, Aristotle 1984, p. 674, 424a. The quote from Locke introduces another metaphor, in which observation and reflection are both fountains of knowledge. The implicit analogy underlying this metaphor involves the correspondences water/knowledge and shoot/produces. Kant was fond of the foundation metaphor, as evident in the titles of his books, Foundation, Grundlegung, of the Metaphysics of Morals and Metaphysical Foundations, and Anfangsgrund, of Natural Science. Frege also used the metaphor in the title of his Foundations, Grundlagen, of Arithmetic. Moreover, in the Basic Laws of Arithmetic, he explicitly used it in attacking psychologistic approaches to mathematics, Frege 1964, p. 13. I understand by laws of logic not psychological laws of takings to be true, but laws of truth. If being true is thus independent of being acknowledged by somebody or other, then the laws of truth are not psychological laws, they are boundary stones set in an eternal foundation, which our thought can overflow, but never displace. This passage amplifies Descartes' foundation metaphor by stressing the permanent nature of the foundation and specifying laws of logic as being as important as boundary stones. Similarly, Husserl, 1965, pages 75-76, in his ambition to make philosophy a rigorous science, wrote, "For with this blunt emphasis on the unscientific character of all previous philosophy, the question immediately arises whether philosophy is to continue envisioning the goal of being a rigorous science, whether it can or must want to be so. Is it to be a philosophical system in the traditional sense, like a Minerva springing forth complete and full panoplied from the head of some creative genius, only in later times to be kept along with other such Minervas in the silent museum of history? Or is it to be a philosophical system of doctrine that, after the gigantic preparatory work of generations, really begins from the ground up with a foundation free of doubt and rises up like any skillful construction, wherein stone is set upon stone, each as solid as the other, in accord with directive insights? Like Descartes, Spinoza, Kant, and Frege, Husserl wanted philosophical knowledge to be an unchallengeable edifice built on an unassailable foundation. However, not all philosophers have thought that a foundation for knowledge is achievable or desirable, and they have used a wealth of metaphors to outline an alternative view of the nature of knowledge. 3 Coherence metaphors. In 1860, Charles Peirce published an incisive attack on Cartesian epistemology, rejecting the method of universal doubt. Peirce criticized the idea of a chain of reasoning that Descartes derived from mathematical proof. According to Peirce, 1958, pages 40-41, reasoning should be understood as a cable rather than a chain. Philosophy ought to imitate the successful sciences in its methods, so far as to proceed only from tangible premises which can be subjected to careful scrutiny, and to trust rather to the multitude and variety of its arguments than to the conclusiveness of any one. Its reasoning should not form a chain which is no stronger than its weakest link, but a cable whose fibers may be ever so slender, provided they are sufficiently numerous and intimately connected. The cable metaphor is a powerful antidote to the chain and foundation metaphors that have dominated much of epistemology. What matters is not the strength of a particular proposition, but its connections with numerous other propositions. The metaphor that reasoning is a cable is based on a complex analogy that involves interrelated correspondences, fiber/beliefs, cable/set of interconnected beliefs, and strength of cable/validity of knowledge. These elements are causally related, in that just as the number and interconnection of fibers is what makes a cable strong, the number and interconnection of beliefs is what makes them justified. Justification is then a matter of coherence rather than foundations. In the 20th century, the most influential coherentist metaphor has been Otto Neurath's ship, which he used in arguing against empiricist foundationalism based on protocol statements concerning sense experience. In the 1930s, Neurath, 1959, p. 201, wrote, "There is no way of taking conclusively established pure protocol sentences as the starting point of the sciences. No tabula rasa exists. We are like sailors who must rebuild their ship on the open sea, never able to dismantle it in dry dock and to reconstruct it there out of the best materials. Only the metaphysical elements can be allowed to vanish without trace. Vague linguist conglomerations always remain in one way or another as components of the ship. The analogical correspondences here include sailors/scientists, ship components/beliefs, and ship repair/belief revision." Like Peirce, Neurath takes scientific knowledge as canonical rather than mathematics, where the axiomatic method suggests the possibility of a foundational approach. But where Peirce used the cable metaphor to challenge rationalist foundationalism, Neurath used the ship metaphor to challenge empiricist foundationalism. Neurath's metaphor was popularized by W. V. Auquin, 1960, pages 3 to 4. Neurath has likened science to a boat which, if we are to rebuild it, we must rebuild plank by plank while staying afloat in it. The philosopher and the scientist are in the same boat. Our boat stays afloat because at each alteration we keep the bulk of it intact as a going concern. In developing his critique of the analytic-synthetic distinction, Quine, 1963, p. 42, used a series of metaphors. The totality of our knowledge is a man-made fabric which impinges on experience only along the edges. Or, to change the figure, total science is like a field of force whose boundary conditions are experience. Quine and Ullian, 1970, called their book on argumentation The Web of Belief, using another metaphor that suggests that knowledge is a matter of multiple interconnections rather than foundations. They explain belief revision by analogy to what automobile mechanics do, Quine and Ullian 1970, p. 8. Often in assessing beliefs we do best to assess several in combination. A very accomplished mechanic might be able to tell us something about an automobile's engine by examining its parts one by one, each in complete isolation from the others, but it would surely serve his purpose better to see the engine as a whole with all the parts functioning together. So with what we believe. It is in the light of the full body of our beliefs that candidates gain acceptance or rejection. Any independent merits of a candidate tend to be less decisive. Here beliefs correspond to engine parts, and the validity of a set of beliefs depends on their all working together like the parts of an engine. Other epistemologists and philosophers of science have used different metaphors to inspire a non-foundationalist picture of knowledge. Karl Popper, 1959, p. 111, wrote, "The empirical basis of objective science has thus nothing absolute about it. Science does not rest upon rock bottom. The bold structure of its theories rises, as it were, above a swamp. It is like a building erected on piles. The piles are driven down from above into the swamp, but not down to any natural or given base, and when we cease our attempts to drive our piles into a deeper layer, it is not because we have reached firm ground. We simply stop when we are satisfied that they are firm enough to carry the structure, at least for the time being." Like foundationalists, Popper uses a building metaphor, but he gives it an anti-foundationalist twist by denying that the base is firm. Susan Haack, 1993, ch. 4, articulates a position she calls foundherentism, intended as a synthesis of foundationalism and coherentism, by comparing knowledge to crossword puzzles. The correctness of a word depends on the correctness of all the words with which it intersects, requiring a kind of coherence. In moral epistemology, the dominant metaphor has been John Rawls' 1971 notion of reflective equilibrium. According to Rawls, ethical principles are justified by balancing them against ethical intuitions, which in turn are justified by how well they fit with ethical principles. Principles and intuitions are to be balanced against each other until reflective equilibrium is reached. Rawls compared this coherentist approach to ethics to the proposal of Nelson Goodman 1965 that logical principles are not justified a priori but rather on how well they fit with inferential practice. Thus the most prominent current methodology in ethics and political philosophy is based on the equilibrium metaphor and an analogy to logical justification. We thus have a wealth of coherentist alternatives to foundational metaphors for knowledge: cables, ships, fabrics, fields of force, engines, piles in swamps, crossword puzzles, and equilibria. None of these metaphors, however, suggests a means for actually carrying out belief revision. Foundationalists can provide specific models of what building an epistemological system looks like by pointing to deductive proofs in mathematics and logic, but coherentists have historically been much vaguer about how beliefs might be justified by their interconnections with each other. A recent theory of explanatory coherence, however, exploits analogies between belief systems and neural networks to develop a rigorous computational model of coherentist belief revision. Thagard, 1989, 1992, 2000, developed ECHO, a computer program that assesses beliefs with respect to whether they are part of the best explanation of available evidence, by analogy with artificial neural networks. The components of such networks are artificial neurons linked to each other by excitatory and inhibitory connections that spread activation among the neurons. Thagard realized that such networks could be used to compute explanatory coherence. Propositions can be represented by artificial neurons, and the compatibility and incompatibility relations between propositions can be represented by excitatory and inhibitory links between neurons. The degree of activation of the neurons after they have repeatedly excited and inhibited each other corresponds to the degree of acceptability of the propositions that they represent. The result of the analogy between belief revision and neuronal processing is a computational model of explanatory coherence that has been used to simulate many kinds of reasoning in science, law, and everyday life. 4 other philosophical metaphors and analogies. The history of philosophy contains many other metaphors and analogies that cannot be classified as either foundationalist or coherentist. One of the most famous is Plato's cave analogy, from Book 7 of the Republic. It is too long to quote, but here is a summary from Holyoake and Thagard, 1995, pages 169 to 170. Plato used an extended analogy to try to undercut the common sense view that knowledge is derived from sense perception. Plato imagined a long cave in which people spend their whole lives fettered to one spot, unable to turn their heads. All they can see is shadows cast upon a wall by the light of a fire burning higher up the cave. The shadows are of various puppets and implements that, unknown to the people in the cave, are carried in front of the fire by others. Plato argued that the knowledge we receive from our senses is like the beliefs that the prisoners in the cave have about this shadow. The prisoners assume from their limited experience that they are achieving knowledge of reality, when in fact they are only perceiving a dull projection of the outside world. On the one hand, the cave analogy is an attack on empiricist foundationalism, designed to show the weakness of sense experience as a source of knowledge. Plato's aim, however, was not to espouse coherentism, but rather to defend a kind of rationalist foundationalism via the theory of forms. 2 other analogies in the Republic contributed to the same aim: the comparison of the sun and the good, and the divided line analogy. Although Francis Bacon wrote before Descartes and Locke, he had a keen understanding of how knowledge requires both sense experience and reasoning. The synthesis is summarized in this brilliant analogy from 1620, Bacon 1960, p. 93. Those who have handled sciences have been either men of experiment or men of dogmas. The men of experiment are like the ant, they only collect and use. The reasoners resemble spiders who make cobwebs out of their own substance. But the bee takes a middle course. It gathers its material from the flowers of the garden and of the field, but transforms and digests it by a power of its own. Not unlike this is the true business of philosophy, for it neither relies solely or chiefly on the powers of the mind, nor does it take the matter which it gathers from natural history and mechanical experiments, and lay it up in the memory hole as it finds it, but lays it up in the understanding altered and digested. Therefore, from a closer and purer league between these two faculties, the experimental and the rational, such as has never yet been made, much may be hoped. This passage involves a triple comparison: empiricists are like ants, rationalists are like spiders, but sensible epistemologists are bees who both gather food and transform it. Bacon's analogy shows the limitations of both empiricist and rationalist foundationalism, but it is not explicitly coherentist. In Bacon's day, philosophy referred to what are now called the natural sciences as well as philosophy. The relation between philosophy and the sciences remains controversial, and different metaphors are used to express different visions of it. It is still common to refer to philosophy as the queen of the sciences. This metaphor dates back at least to Boethius, 1969, p. 36, in the 6th century, who personified philosophy as a queenly figure with books in one hand and a scepter in the other. Competitively, other fields including mathematics, politics, and theology have been styled as the queen of the sciences. In contrast, Aquinas described philosophy and other sciences as a handmaiden to transcendent theology, Aquinas 1945. In contrast, Locke, 1961, Volume 1, pxxxv, viewed his philosophical efforts as subordinate to those of scientists such as Newton. It is ambition enough to be employed as an under-laborer, in clearing ground a little, and removing some of the rubbish that lies in the way to knowledge. Nietzsche, 1966, p. 135-137, in turn derided the idea that philosophy should be reduced to theory of knowledge or subordinated to science. Rather, genuine philosophers are those who vivisect the virtues and assumptions of their age, who dare to create new values and be legislators of the future. Our own preference is to see philosophy as neither superior nor subordinate to natural science, but as a partner in understanding the world. This conception is developed further in the next section. First, we want to mention two famous metaphors for the enterprise of philosophy as a whole. Hegel, 1952, pages 12-13, wrote, "When philosophy paints its gray in gray, then has a shape of life grown old. By philosophy's gray in gray it cannot be rejuvenated but only understood. The owl of Minerva spreads its wings only with the falling of the dusk." Minerva was the Roman goddess of wisdom, equivalent to the Greek goddess Athena. She was associated with the owl. Hence the owl of Minerva is a metaphor for philosophy. Hegel's point is that philosophy understands reality only in hindsight, or that it grasps the meaning of a particular intellectual and cultural period only as it passes away. For Hegel, philosophy was deeply bound up with intellectual history. In the 20th century, the most famous metaphor for philosophy is probably Wittgenstein's, 1968 p. 103. What is your aim in philosophy? To shoo the fly the way out of the fly bottle. The point of the metaphor is clear from his previous ones. Philosophical problems arise when language goes on holiday, p. 19. Philosophy is a battle against the bewitchment of our intelligence by means of language, p. 47. Both metaphors suggest that philosophical problems arise from linguistic confusions, so that the solution to them comes from escaping the confusions. Philosophy is then like a kind of therapy against itself. On this view, philosophy is focused on language and operates independently of the sciences. 5. The nature of philosophy. We now want to consider what conclusions can be drawn from the fact that metaphors and analogies have played such a prominent role in epistemology. One possible conclusion is that this prominence is a sign of philosophical weakness. In his poem, Very Like a Whale, Ogden Nash wrote, "One thing that literature would be greatly the better for would be a more restricted employment by authors of simile and metaphor." Is the same true of epistemology and philosophy in general? The fact that some of the most esteemed of all philosophers, from Plato to Quine, have employed metaphors and analogies in developing their epistemologies suggests otherwise. We need a conception of philosophy that explains why metaphors are valuable, not why they should be reduced or eliminated. One conception of epistemology that would explain the centrality of metaphor allies philosophy with poetry and other kinds of literary discourse. Metaphors are ubiquitous in and crucial to poetry, Lakoff and Turner 1989. So if philosophy is a kind of poetic discourse, we have an explanation of why metaphors are so common in epistemology. It is obvious, however, that the aims of the philosophers whose metaphors were quoted in sections 2 to 4 were very different from the aims of most poets. Plato, Aristotle, Bacon, Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, Locke, Kant, Hegel, Frege, Husserl, Peirce, Neurath, and Quine were not mainly trying to produce evocative language, but rather to deepen understanding of the nature of knowledge. A second conception of philosophy that would explain its use of metaphor associates it with political rhetoric aimed at increasing the power and influence of a philosopher. Rhetoricians since Aristotle have noticed the major contribution that metaphor makes to efforts to convince other people. And part of the reason why epistemologists use metaphors is that they make views more appealing to readers and listeners. Foundational and coherentist metaphors are used to make their proponents' epistemological positions both clearer and more appealing to their audience. However, we do not think that the uses of metaphor in philosophy are merely rhetorical. Epistemologists aim to convince their readers not just for the sake of convincing them, but because they think they have a theory of the structure and growth of knowledge that is descriptively and prescriptively better than alternative theories. Metaphors undoubtedly have a rhetorical role, just as they have an evocative one, but they also have an explanatory role that we now discuss. We contend that philosophical uses of metaphor and analogy are similar to scientific ones. Holyoake and Thagard, 1995, ch. 8, distinguish 4 different uses of analogies in science: discovery, development, evaluation, and exposition. Analogies have contributed to such major scientific discoveries as Darwin's theory of evolution and Maxwell's theory of electromagnetic forces. Analogies have also contributed to the theoretical and experimental development of scientific ideas, for example when Darwin used the analogy between natural and artificial selection to better understand evolution. Moreover, Darwin and other great scientists such as Galileo also used analogies in arguing for the acceptability of their theories. Finally, scientists and science educators often use analogies as part of their attempts to communicate ideas to others. Similarly, analogies in philosophy have contributed to the origin and development of epistemological theories. Euclidean geometry suggested to thinkers such as Descartes and Spinoza how they should develop their foundationalist epistemologies. Empiricist foundationalists took inspiration instead from wax tablets and white paper. Coherentist epistemologists have needed metaphors such as cables, boats, crossword puzzles, and neural networks to suggest how beliefs could be evaluated on the basis of their fit with one another. In science, analogies are a relatively minor part of the evaluation of theories, which depends more on how well competing theories explain the relevant experimental evidence, Thagard 1992. In epistemology, however, there is not much empirical evidence directly relevant to the assessment of theories of knowledge, so that metaphors and analogies carry much more of the evaluative burden than occurs in science. Because it is not clear just what foundational and coherentist theories are supposed to explain, much of their plausibility comes from the intuitive appeal of the competing metaphors. Whereas a scientist can lay out the empirical arguments for accepting a theory, philosophers adduce a variety of considerations, both descriptive and normative, that make their epistemologies plausible. Thus evaluation and exposition blur together more than in scientific discourse. Describing knowledge as a cable both helps to expound an anti-foundationalist view and to support its credibility in making sense of human knowledge. Richer analogies such as the neural network underpinning of Thagard's 2000 coherence theories make for expanded credibility by tying epistemological theories in with empirical results from cognitive psychology and neuroscience. The result is not a reduction of philosophy to the sciences, because epistemology includes an essentially normative component that differentiates it from the descriptive theories of the sciences. To expand Peirce's metaphor, we can think of science and philosophy as 2 intertwined and intermingled cables that jointly contribute to making sense of the human condition, in both descriptive and prescriptive aspects. In sum, the uses of metaphor and analogy in epistemology and philosophy in general are much the same as their uses in science. Analogy is a powerful mode of thought that is indispensable in the formation, development, evaluation, and exposition of theories, in philosophy as well as science. Like science, philosophy is primarily theory development, not poetry or rhetoric, even though rhetoric and even poetry can sometimes be displayed in both fields. Philosophy is not the queen, handmaiden, or underlaborer of the sciences, but rather a partner in a collaborative endeavor to understand and improve the world. Paul Thagard and Craig Beam. Philosophy Department, University of Waterloo, Waterloo, Ontario, Canada N2L3G1. P. Thagard at uwaterloo.ca. References. Aquinas, T. 1948. Introduction to St. Thomas Aquinas, ed. A. Pegues. New York, Modern Library. Aristotle. 1984 The Complete Works of Aristotle. Princeton, Princeton University Press. Boethius. 1969 The Consolation of Philosophy, V. E. Watts, Transaction. Harmonsworth, Penguin Books. Descartes, R. 1984. Philosophical Writings of Descartes, J. Cottingham and R. Stuthoff and D. Murdoch, Transaction. Cambridge, Cambridge University Press. Freya, G. 1964. The Basic Laws of Arithmetic. M. Firth, Transaction. Berkeley, University of California Press. Goodman, N. 1965. Fact, Fiction, and Forecast, 2 ed. Indianapolis, Bobbs Merrill. Hawk, S. 1993. Evidence and Inquiry, Towards Reconstruction in Epistemology. Oxford, Blackwell. Hegel, G. 1952. Hegel's Philosophy of Right, T. M. Knox, Transaction. London, Oxford University Press. Holyoake, K. J., and Thagard, P. 1995. Mental Leaps, Analogy in Creative Thought. Cambridge, Ma, MIT Press/Bradford Books. Husserl, E. 1965. Phenomenology and the Crisis of Philosophy, Q. Lauer, Transaction. New York, Harper Torch Books. Lakoff, G., and Turner, M. 1989. More Than Cool Reason, A Field Guide to Poetic Metaphor. Chicago, University of Chicago Press. Leibniz, G. W. 1981. New Essays on Human Understanding, P. Remnant and J. Bennett, Transaction. Cambridge, Cambridge University Press. Locke, J. 1961. An Essay Concerning Human Understanding. London, Dent. Neurath, O. 1959. Protocol Sentences. In Logical Positivism, edited by A. J. Ayer, pages 199 to 208. Glencoe, Illinois, The Free Press. Newman, L. 1999. Descartes Epistemology. In Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. http://plato.stanford.edu/entries/Descartes-epistemology. Nietzsche, F. 1966. Beyond Good and Evil, W. Kaufman, Transaction. New York, Random House. Peirce, C.S. 1958. Charles S. Peirce, Selected Writings. New York, Dover. Popper, K. 1959. The Logic of Scientific Discovery. London, Hutchinson. Quine, W. V. O. 1960. Word and Object. Cambridge, Ma, MIT Press. Quine, W. V. O. 1963. From a Logical Point of View, 2 ed. New York, Harper Torch Books. Quine, W. V. O. 1966. The Ways of Paradox and Other Essays. New York, Random House. Rawls, J. 1971. A Theory of Justice. Cambridge, Mott, Harvard University Press. Thagard, P. 1989. Explanatory Coherence. Behavioral and Brain Sciences 12, 435-467. Thagard, P. 1992. Conceptual Revolutions. Princeton, Princeton University Press. Thagard, P. 2000. Coherence in Thought and Action. Cambridge, Mott, MIT Press. Wittgenstein, L. 1968. Philosophical Investigations, Gem Anscombe, Transaction 2nd ed. Oxford, Blackwell. Back to Coherence Articles Table of Contents. Back to Computational Epistemology Laboratory.